All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 EBSS Virtual Research Forum, which offers librarians an opportunity to present current research, especially research that's relevant to the education and behavioral sciences areas. My name is Jaleesa Kenyon, and I am the chair of the EBSS Research Committee, which organizes this event each year. In case you are new to EBSS, we are the Education and Behavioral Sciences section of ACRL. We were formed in 1968 and have approximately 1,000 members. We always welcome new members who are interested in education and behavioral sciences librarianship. Before we get started with our presentations today, I'd like to acknowledge and thank this year's research committee, Diana, Melissa, Robin, Emily, Kelly, and Thomas. Thank you all for your time and your effort putting this forum on, as well as reviewing all of the presentations that we received. Today's presentations were selected via a competitive open peer review process. During this process, the committee looked for original research that measured or investigated issues of high interest to educational and behavioral sciences librarians. We also evaluated each proposal's research design and analysis, relevance and value, and innovation, as well as how their research impacts diverse communities. Each presenter will have 10 to 15 minutes to present, and during each presentation, please share any questions you have in the chat, and we'll ask them during the question and discussion section after all 4 presentations are complete. At the end of the forum, we'll also share a link to a feedback survey and the presenter slides, which will also be shared with the recording once that's sent out. So with that, let's get started with presentation number 1, Individual Research Consultations and Social Work Students, Understanding Feelings, Thoughts, and Actions During the Information Search Process by Patrick Leeport.
All right, let me share my slides here. All right. Thank you, everyone in attendance, and a special thank you to the committee who put this forum together. I'm really excited to share some of my work today and hear from others as well. My name is Patrick Leeport. I'm the Research and Instruction Services Librarian at Bemidji State University in far northern Minnesota. What I'm sharing today with you all is a presentation that stems from my dissertation research, which I completed an education doctorate at Winona State University. This is the 10 to 15 minute version. If you all need some help sleeping or want the 200-page version, the link at the bottom of the screen will take you there too in the follow-up slides. So before I get into the research, I want to share with you all a little bit about the context. So like I mentioned, I work at Bemidji State University. We have an undergraduate social work program, and I've been providing individual research consultations for the social work research seminar course since about 2015. Within this course, they have a literature review assignment, generally finding at least 10 primary sources about a topic of their choosing type of literature review. The modality of the IRCs varies semester to semester. The data I collected, the modality was all Zoom. We have a hybrid program at BSU. And depending on the semester, I complete about 15 to 40 individual research consultations, depending on enrollment and how many sections are offered that semester. The semester I collected data, we were close to that 40 number. The individual research consultations are scheduled for 60 minutes, and they typically last between 45 and 60. And for me, what the benefit of individual research consultations is they're tailored to the specific needs of students coming to the consultation, right? So for me, that's the big difference between group instruction or one-shots and IRCs. That being said, even though no 2 IRCs are identical, there are some themes that I covered in a good majority of all the IRCs that I use to work with students. You can see things like identifying the appropriate scope of investigation, right, defining a topic, thinking about more common things like discovery and access, thinking about specifying and articulating an information need. I spent a lot of time working with students creating outlines, right? I talk to them about how if they're able to articulate what information they're looking for, the search becomes a lot easier. We talk about reading scholarly articles, not just primary versus secondary, but also thinking about and understanding social work research articles as a genre and how to digest those. As needed, we also think through citation and research management strategies, whether that's formal citation management softwares or other preferences, depends on what the student's looking for. But honestly, how I start each of these individual research consultations is asking students, what's the big boulder that we need to move, right? How can we get started? And typically asking that question, we're able to address a lot of these other pieces of content along the way. So thinking about that, the process itself, right? Maybe working in your library, you have similar experiences with individual research consultations. I started thinking about what is the value of this? I'm committing 40 hours at minimum to provide these IRCs in a one-on-one setting. And I wanted to do some research. So as a practitioner scholar, I looked towards both my practice and the existing literature that was out there and saw some similarities. First of all, I was surprised to see 90% plus participation in these IRCs. And mind you, these aren't required. Students aren't getting extra credit. So I was kind of blown away by the amount of participation I saw in these IRCs. Positive student anecdotes, students reporting good things to me and to others about the IRCs. And then faculty noting things like, you're showing up in a good way on our end of course semester evaluations, right? Something is useful is happening here. And then when I looked to see in the literature, there was a great scoping review out there that looked to see how IRCs were assessed largely. And they looked at perceptions, and consistent with my experience, librarians and students were reporting positive outcomes, perceiving that things went well. Things like learning outcomes, different learning analytics. Students had better bibliographies. They were getting better course grades and grades on their assignment, all good things. And then just looking at usage statistics and how students utilize IRCs. So I started thinking about, it's amazing, it's great. I'm excited that all of these things are happening. Students come to an IRC and they're seeing the benefit and reporting it. It's great that they're coming to an IRC and they yield better grades. But for me, what was missing was that in-between step, right? It's wonderful that these awesome things are happening, but what happens because of that IRC that leads to some of those good changes, right? And for me, that really came down to what behaviors change. And I really wanted to focus in on that middle ground of where the learning happens and what changes within students that lead to those good results. So I went out and looked at different theoretical frameworks for information seeking and revisited some, like the information search process, probably one of the most popular. And thinking about those three domains of affective, cognitive, and physical really helped me whittle down where I wanted to go with this research, right? Because figuring out how to ask those questions was the first step before figuring out how I wanted to answer them. And figuring out how behaviors change is such a huge question that this framework really helped me make it a little bit more tangible and answerable. So my research questions was, how does an IRC with a librarian change undergraduate social work students' feelings, thoughts, and actions during that information search process? And to answer that question, I knew that if I wanted to think about behaviors, observational study, I kept coming back to it. I thought it would be the most useful. And I knew I was going to be interacting with these students online. So I started thinking about different research designs and methods that would allow me to collect observational data in an online setting. And I came across screencast videography. I won't read the whole brick of text there for you, giving a more abstract definition of what it is. But you can think of it, if you're familiar with UX research, it's kind of a sibling or cousin to that kind of thing. And basically what I did is I got IRB approval, recruited participants. I had 7. I did the logistics of the scheduling. And then the first time I collected data, I met with the student via Zoom. I met with the participant on Zoom, and I explained the study, and I basically said, I want you to look for information as you normally would. The only difference is I want you to talk out loud through the process. For me, the idea was I want to be as close to a fly on the wall watching this student search as possible. So I met with students. I had them record the first time, right, meeting via Zoom, have them talk aloud through their search process. And then those recordings lasted between 45 minutes, an hour, and 15 minutes. After that, within 3 days, we scheduled that individual research consultation, which I kind of outlined earlier. And then again, within 3 days after that, I had them meet with me again and repeat that screencast videography process where they again recorded their screens and talked out loud through their search process. After that, I had 14, 15 hours worth of video data to analyze and look through. And my friends joked around with me that I was really going to spend Saturdays watching students search in databases in this video data, but I got a lot of good insights out of it. And I had additional follow-up questions for these students. So I created some semi-structured interviews. And I met with those students and got feedback, basically trying to align, is what I'm seeing in these videos, does that align with the way you're thinking about this, or am I missing something here, right? So it was, in a way, it was to help me validate some of that data. After that, and I recalibrated my analysis a little bit. I met with the faculty member just to add another vantage point and to help triangulate some of that data. And that was kind of my final step, is what I'm seeing and what I've talked to the students about, is this consistent with your experience as well? And then I went through and analyzed hours and hours of qualitative data. And here are some of my findings. Obviously, in the 10 to 15 minute version, I won't include all of them, but I wanted to include one for each of the research questions that I looked to tackle. And I chose these specifically, A, because I thought they were interesting findings, and B, because I think they really demonstrated findings that were unique to my specific data collection method, right? I feel like the video data really spoke to these in ways that surveys or interviews might not have. So in terms of my first research question about feelings, I wasn't surprised, and you all likely aren't either, to figure out that confusion and frustration changed to clarity and confidence after that individual research consultation. What I think is a really interesting example to back up this finding was when a student used the link resolver. In the pre-IRC recording, the student they used the links to full text button. And as you've probably experienced, 3 or 4 different databases popped up with that link to the full text. The student was confused. They weren't sure which one to click on. They ended up clicking on all 4 and expressed their frustration. This is all the same article, right? I'm not really clear what's going on here. Post-IRC, that same student didn't talk at all about the process of using the link resolver. It was second nature. That student was clicking through without commenting on it at all. They were talking about how excited they were about reading that abstract. And by the time they hit that article, the full text of the article, they were talking about what they were hoping to find within that article, right? So that process work, right? The teaching students where to click, which we try to get past to that higher level thinking. I was really excited to hear about how that student had moved from process-based thinking to higher level lit review thinking is one way I think about that. So as far as thoughts go, I was really surprised by the way students thought about including or excluding articles for their literature review, right? And I mean that in a broad sense. So prior to the IRC, many of the students, right, would get their first page of results, those 20 results, and they would immediately say in this recording, I'm going to exclude a bunch of these, right? These 16, because I see this specific aspect that I'm not really interested in. And that was useful in a normal process within the information search process. What was really interesting to me is post-IRC, many more of the students were focusing on reasons why they would include articles, right? So rather than saying, I'm excluding these 16, they would get really excited and animated and talk about the 1 or 2 that they really liked out of those search results, as animated as undergrads get about talking lit review, right? But they were really excited to be able to articulate why they were interested in that specific article. And for me, that really resonated because they were able to, right, identify and articulate that specific need rather than recognizing what it wasn't. And then finally, I think probably for me, what was one of the most tangible examples, and it was really palpable watching the videos, is seeing how students read articles before and after the IRC. Prior to the IRC, there were kind of 2 options. The student would open it for 15 seconds and go, yeah, I think this is close. I'm going to keep it open in a new tab or find a way to get back to it. Or I saw students scroll through the entire article, right, top to bottom. Compared to the the post-IRC recording, I saw students a lot more focused in understanding the genre of the social work literature a little bit more, and understanding I'm going to read the introduction right now. I'm not going to struggle through the methods and analysis because that's not relevant to my specific literature review I'm working on right now, right? So I could almost feel their fingers speed up a little bit as they got to that method section, and they understood I don't need to read this super in depth right now. I'm just looking to skim and get a baseline understanding of that methods. Compared to the discussion, I could really feel it slow down, and students started really thinking more critically about what they were finding in that aspect of the article. Like I said, these are just some of the tip of the iceberg findings. If you want to go out and look more at the dissertation, you're welcome to. But that's what I wanted to share with you all today. And I'll turn it back to Jaleesa and the rest of the presenters. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. Very, very interesting research and findings. I'm sure folks are going to have a lot of interesting questions for you. Okay, so let's, excuse me, pass it on to Caitlin Stewart and Jenelle Johnson.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm here with Jenelle, and we're going to be talking about our research on the relationship between education student enrollment and curriculum material centers and collections budgets. I am coming to you from Illinois State University. There, my official title is Teaching and Learning Librarian, but I'm the head of our curriculum material center there. I'll let Jenelle introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Jenelle Johnson, and I work for the University of Pittsburgh Library System, and I'm based out of the University of Pitt Bradford. And I oversee, I'm a liaison to the social sciences and education department, and that leads me to work with our CMC collection and materials.
Absolutely. So we had one really big research question that we were seeking answers to, which was simply, is there a statistical relationship between undergraduate education student enrollment, graduate education student enrollment, and total education student enrollment with funding levels of curriculum material centers across the United States? There's this kind of prevalent assumption that if you have more education students, you have more funding. And I think that's tied to the perception that usually larger universities have more funding. But we were interested to know if there's actually a relationship between education student enrollment of those three types and curriculum material center budgets. And I'll call curriculum material centers CMCs for the rest of our time together. We had a couple of objectives as we were doing this research as well, and one was to provide a more detailed analysis of key data collected in the Directory of Curriculum Materials Centers and Collections 8th edition. For those of you who are not aware, the EBSS ACRL Curriculum Materials Committee has periodically released a directory of known CMCs across the United States, and Canada has been included in some iterations, and basically collects various factors such as education students, funding, the types of resources they have. And we were seeking to do a study comparing some variables that were captured in the work done by that committee recently in 2023. We also wanted to identify a statistical method to interpret the information collected as ordinal variables in past CMC research. So when I'm talking about ordinal variables, usually that's talking about ranges that are options and multiple choice questions. And that's been frequently used in CMC research so that people can complete surveys more quickly because they don't have to find exact numbers of student enrollment or exact numbers of their budget. They can select the range that has the number of students they think their university falls in. And it means survey completion is faster, so more people complete the survey, but it also makes tracking patterns a lot more complicated because you don't have the facts, you just have the range that someone has indicated. We also really wanted to create a more detailed resource for education or education adjacent library personnel to use to advocate for collection funding, looking at peer institutions, and we wanted to position our findings with work and research that has been historically done in this space. I want to highlight a quote from Tillman from 2001 that really struck Jenelle and I when we were doing our literature review and seemed to resonate with many of our findings in our own research, which is that in many cases, CMCs are highly used, historically underfunded, and politically powerless. And that's really the positionality that the literature review showed us. And I'll pass it over to Jenelle to share some of the crucial literature.
So to summarize the literature that has been critical to our research and to provide historical context for the use of CMCs, education enrollment, and also CMC budgets, first we want to cite Tillman, who was on the quote from the previous slide, who noted a trend that CMC materials, the services, the facilities are used far more than the typical library service. However, they receive a much smaller proportion of the budget. And that led us to want to understand better how this much smaller proportion of the budget impacts CMC personnel. And we found that Altieri stated that CMC personnel felt anxiety regarding the insufficient budgets of CMCs, and also cited that those who work in CMCs believe that it's difficult to provide a high quality and sufficient material, also high quality services, and provide the facilities necessary to carry out the curriculum and resource duties, I guess would be the best word. And so if we know this is a prevalent trend, why do we lack the ability to highlight the gap between the use, the education enrollment, and the fundings of CMCs? And we actually looked to Catalano, noted this trend is partially due to the difficulties of interpreting studies that use ordinal variables, or in other words, budget ranges, rather than exact values. And so while using ranges allows for this efficient survey in hopes of recruiting more people or getting more people to finish this survey, it really complicates one's ability to compare CMC's budgets to enrollment. And so that led us to examine what comparative studies have been completed. We found TOEFL's 1992 study most directly related to our research. TOEFL collected data from 172 CMCs and compared total student enrollment to CMC funding. However, we want to note that TOEFL did not use ranges, but collected a value for each CMC budget and determined a positive linear relationship between budget and total student enrollment, not just education enrollment. And so studies and anecdotal evidence establish that CMC personnel perceive a lack of funding for CMCs. Therefore, it's really essential to ensure that CMC personnel can specify factors of how can we support adequate funding. And so earlier guidelines established by Laurel et al., they used a formula to develop funding based on education student enrollment. So such as like if you had 250 to 499 students, their formula was $5,000 for the first 250 students, and then $12 per student above the 250. However, a more modern approach no longer provides a formula based on student enrollment. Instead, Polly et al. Considers additional factors to overcome that problem of an enrollment being a lagging indicator. So instead, through ACRL's publication of guidelines for CMCs, Polly et al. Has this recommendation based on 4 CMC funding based on complying with the accrediting body and State Department of Education standards, aligning it with professional CMC standards in the area of collections, facilities, services, and also personnel. And finally, meeting college departments of education program needs and also reflecting their enrollment.
All right, so I'm going to dive into our methodology a little bit. We gave this context earlier that we were building off of the data collected by the ACRL EBSS Curriculum Material Committee that was captured in the 8th edition of the directory published in 2023. And we were looking at the universities which were included in that directory, and we were specifically interested in the data captured for university name, undergraduate education enrollment, graduate education enrollment, and materials or collection budget. Once we eliminated universities that had elected not to answer some of those questions or answered in a free text form that wasn't comparable to the other institutions, we were left with a sample size of 80 universities. I will also specify that we intended to exclude any Canadian institutions just so that it was focused on the United States, but none qualified for that anyways. So then we were left with the problem of how do we actually see if there's a statistical relationship between education student enrollment and CMC budgets, especially since we have those ordinal variables that don't have absolute measurements. So they can't actually be treated as numbers, even though the ordinal variables hold numbers in their text. So I was looking at rank-based statistical analyses, and we ended up deciding to use Spearman's rank correlation coefficient, where ordinal variables have an order. So when you're looking at budgets, even though they're not numbers, you can say this range is smaller than that range is bigger than this range. So you can still rank them to see what's small, what's large. So basically we converted all of our data on education student enrollment for undergraduate and graduate and CMC budgets to ranks to say that you get a higher rank for each of those categories if you're large, a smaller rank if you're small, and then you compare those ranks for those variables to see how they trend together. So it's a way to still analyze findings in this way. We did this on 3 different levels. One is we kept undergraduate education enrollment by itself, and the first scatter plot on the left has undergraduate education enrollment rank as the y-axis and CMC collection budget rank on the x-axis, and you can see that it's pretty scattered. It just looks like a scatter plot. In the second graph as well, we have the only change is that we looked at graduate education enrollment rank. And then the third graph is where we were looking at what we call combined education enrollment rank, which is considering both undergraduate and graduate enrollment. And that's the first time we started to actually see that, maybe there is some type of relationship. I will point out that you'll notice these stacked dots. So already before statistical analysis with Spearman's, we were looking at likely a pretty wide variety across institutions. So we had 3 null hypotheses where we were, and our null hypotheses were that there was no correlation existing between undergraduate education enrollment, graduate education enrollment, or combined education student enrollment with CMC budget. And our alternative hypothesis based on this visualization was that there was a positive monotonic relationship, which we were seeking to find if that existed. So in terms of the findings that we had, the nature of the statistical relationship after we ran our calculations was that yes, in fact, there is a positive monotonic correlation between both undergraduate education student enrollment, graduate education student enrollment, and combined education student enrollment with CMC collection funding, but the relationship is quite weak. Spearman's rank correlation coefficient, if it calculates as a 0, that means there's no relationship. Our findings for those 3 variables with CMC collection budget ranged between 0.30 and 0.37. So there is some type of correlation, but it's not a particularly strong one. And the reason for that lower number is that significant variation exists across institutions. And I've tried to visualize that here with this one chart. This one's specific to looking at undergraduate enrollment, where we have the undergraduate education enrollment clusters on our rows and the clusters for funding in our columns, and the number of institutions that had a certain range for undergraduate enrollment or a certain range for budget. And there's a significant spread. So for some areas of enrollment, collection budgets varied by $30,000, which is significant. I also just want to call out that even with ordinal variables, you can still calculate medians, even though you can't calculate means and averages. So we also found that the median institution in our data set served 100 to 500 undergraduate education students, 101 to 500 graduate education students, and had a budget of 5,000 to 10,000 CMC collection. For their CMC collection. And part of why I include this is if you don't do this other statistical analysis, if you collect the data as ordinal variables, that's pretty much the only comparative information you can have. Finally, I want to share some of the practical implications of this. And I really want to position this historically based off of some of the research and concerns we saw in our literature review. And to do that, we compared the findings on these factors in the 8th edition, published in 2023, to the 2nd edition of that directory, published in 1985, almost 40 years earlier. When adjusting for inflation, we were interested to see how budgets for those CMCs had changed in those roughly 4 decades. There were 21 CMCs which occurred in both directories and had shared budgetary information in each. And of them, we found that 11 CMCs had less purchasing power today than they did in 1985. 7 had roughly the same purchasing power, and 3 CMCs had more purchasing power. So that really showed us that there's a decline in the fiscal support for curriculum material centers based on our data, which is especially worrying when earlier literature is about already how CMCs are underfunded and not given the resources they need to thrive. So we're really seeing an exacerbating problem and increasing concern that the fiscal support for many CMCs is insufficient. I will stress, though, our research has showed that there's large variations, so these trends are not necessarily true for all institutions, but by and large, the trend is that CMCs are not keeping up with the rate of inflation and are not able to get the same amount of resources that they could previously to support teacher education. And research very clearly shows that teacher preparation and quality is positively impacted by having hands-on resources to engage with, and that curriculum and material centers are a place to do that. So we're going to end here and pass it on to our next presenter, but we look forward to answering any questions if you have them. And here's a quick peek at our references in case you're interested. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin and Jenelle. That's really, really interesting research. Everyone, please feel free to put your questions in chat, and we'll go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Lesley Farmer.
There we go. Welcome, everybody. Really happy to have this opportunity to share. And just to give you the bottom line on this presentation, it is please partner with your disability support centers because it helps everybody. As a librarian at California State University in Long Beach, which is just south of Los Angeles, I prepared school librarians and also teach educational technology. I also coordinate the education committee as well as the Special Library Association Academic and Education Committee's webinar. And so you are encouraged to take advantage of this free series of presentations that target academic librarians. The other, hat that I'm wearing in this presentation is work that I have done with students with disabilities. I helped found the Academics Applied Disability Studies program at California State University in Long Beach, and have done data analysis with a statistician colleague of mine at our own campus. The other name, Arlene Romas, was one of my students, and she helped in terms of the collection data. So what's the issue? Basically, folks that have disabilities sometimes have a difficult time trying to find information, and you may have noticed that. And oftentimes these students use, or folks in general, use online platforms in order to find information for various reasons. But as you know, there is no perfect website, and some of them can be hard to access and navigate, let alone even within the realm of disabilities services, that information can vary quite a bit, both in terms of the amount of information as well as the quality. And just in general, in terms of the digital range that folks with disabilities have more, challenges in trying to ferret out that information. So to that end, then I was working with our own disability support centers and found that it was sometimes difficult for students to be able to get the information that they needed. And I also knew that our campus is just one of 23 campuses in the California State University system. And we're one of the very largest systems in the United States. And I found out that while these different campuses directors for disability services do connect with each other at least, once a semester, that in general, the governance within our system is pretty decentralized. So I was curious to find out, how does our, center in terms of its website compare to other ones, and see if we could find some patterns and trends then that would help everybody to improve their websites, which then impacts their own level of service, not only for students with disabilities, but the whole academic community. So to that end, I conducted a literature review in terms of websites. There isn't a lot in terms of disability services websites. There are a couple articles that are now being published. You'll find them along with mine in the Journal of Technology and Persons with Disabilities that comes out of the California State University Northridge campus. So we looked at two different aspects of these websites: the content itself and then the technical aspects of it. So in calling out the literature, what you're seeing here are the actual variables that we used. So we're talking about a large spreadsheet with all this information, and then doing a careful content analysis of what was there. Sometimes we would have to go to the main university's website to find some of this information, which then helped us to examine the technical part. So we looked at, the mission and the organization, sorry about the spelling, of the centers. We wanted to find out context. So, how many students are enrolled in that campus, and how many of those students are registered with the services. So DSC is the Disability Support Centers. We also wanted to find out about the staffing and possible advisory, councils, boards, for providing some input, some feedback as to the services and resources. Then, the hard stuff, what kinds of services do they provide? What kinds of accommodations do they support? When are they open? What are their processes, their policies? What kinds of resources do they provide, not only to the students who are registered with them, but also the academic community at large? What kinds of outreach do they do? What kinds of communications, do they send forth? How do they interact with the rest of the academic community and possibly the local community as well? Or their finances, and then how do they assess, their effectiveness? And then in terms of the technical pieces, we used as one of our main pieces, obviously, the WWW3 accessibility checklists, and we used a couple of them in order to just check for consistency. And then we looked at more specific things like, how do they label the content? How is it organized on the page? How do you kind of navigate through the website? What kinds of search features are there? The content, how easy is that to read? What kinds of images do they have? How consistent is their layout and the depth of the information? Is it, does it feel cluttered, or is it pretty straightforward and easily, readable? To what extent can folks kind of control how they navigate? If they make if they go to a particular page, how easy is it for them to get back, for example, or to have some kind of interaction? And how do they prevent, errors? And if they goof up, how do they get back? Which means, are there some, help features? So what we found is that, yes, in general, it's very decentralized. So none of the websites really looked at each other. And in terms of kind of the governance, kind of the big picture, know that a lot of this really depends on the campus organization. So we found that organizationally, disability services were under a lot of different ones. Sometimes academic services, sometimes it was student services, sometimes it was under health, etc. And their hours, really varied. In fact, nobody had, weekend hours, and even evening hours were really limited. So a lot of this is not under the center's control. It really, has to do with, campus leadership and how they organize. That also impacts their staffing, and it's usually tied to campus enrollment, like we saw about, CMCs. Most of the staff are generalists, so regardless of the kind of accommodations, they were able to, the idea was that they could help these students. Outreach did tend to correlate with the number of students served, but that also sort of ended up tying with staffing, so how it could scale up. In terms, in fact, an interesting piece is like for the smaller places, it could vary in terms of the student to staff ratio. For the large institutions, usually that ratio was larger, but that's sort of a efficiency, piece. But there still were a number of staff available in order to do more of that PR work. In terms of how, the services were listed, it was inconsistent. There's inconsistent training and resource information on there. Now, what I would call effective or centers tended to have more social aspects, peer mentoring, some social clubs, that they would have, larger hours. They'd have lots of details, a lot of different kinds of resources, a lot of different kinds of information that would be included in their websites. And then in terms of the techno piece, none of the sites was completely accessible, which is sort of ironic. So there was no website that just really stood out. There were a number of websites that had, really good, specifics, in one particular area. The really, top-notch ones would, provide training for the entire campus, and they did more outreach in terms of the whole community. They would have resources that were not just the centers, but also the campuses, also local, and also, national resources. It was easy to navigate, and they would have search features that were really great. One of the sites had both search feature for just within that website, but also for the whole campus. And you could click, choose which kind of, what would be the scope of your search. So that was really cool. There was just one place that had that. So bottom line, what were some of the recommendations? It's really important to kind of assess your own website. Now, all of this is to say that it's really important for librarians to look at these disability websites in terms of, particularly in terms of their content, because, students may ask at your reference desk, your information center, like, am not doing well in my class. Where do I go for help? I think I've got, difficulty in kind of like reading math equations. Just my eyeballs aren't working great. So, you really need to find out what kinds of information, your disability centers, because it is required that they have one, what kind of resources they have, and how do you contact them, etc. I mentioned about the decentralization. So, for these folks, they really should be looking at each other's websites and kind of spotting, what are, some best practices. There's a lot of time that's involved in creating these websites. And we realize that oftentimes, it's an academic technology person who's actually creating them, but certainly, the disability staff should be talking with the web designers and in order to, make sure that all that information is available in a really easy way to navigate. And it would be really nice, especially, if you've got a, system that has several campuses, just have one template. And again, this could also work, for library websites as well. So for them, and quite frankly, for library services, we want to make sure we always provide, the basic information. What are the services? What are your processes? What kinds of resources, can you supply? And to really, and for disability services, they really need to be giving information not only to the students, but also to faculty and staff in terms of like, well, how do you deal with students who are on, the spectrum? How do you instruct students that have, visual impairments? So all the stakeholders need to know, what are, those accommodations? How can you structure them into the services that you provide? And again, the more that the campuses as a whole can support students with disabilities, all the better, so that we can learn from each other. And then, having local, state, and national resources on their sites is really important. And you as a librarians, it's good for you to know what those are as well. And if you don't see it on the sites, that's a really good conversation starter with disability services to say like, so, what kinds of national resources would you like some help in terms of finding them? Because that's kind of our thing, is locating information. Again, making sure that websites are, accessible. And the earlier on, and this again goes for both libraries as well as, for disability centers, and that is to test your websites with the users. So I would encourage you to work with students that you know of that have, disabilities and, have self-disclosed them, and actually doing a think aloud, just as, Patrick did, in terms of how easy are they able to navigate your own library services? Is there explicit information about accommodations? Do you have a link to the disability services websites? So those are takeaways that apply not only to, the centers that are, serving students, but let's face it, the library is also a center to, serve students with disabilities. So hopefully then this can be useful for you too. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lesley, for sharing your research. And I believe Lesley has to step away for another meeting. So if anyone has questions related to her project, please feel free to put them in chat and I'll be sure to forward them on if you want to leave your email address.
Right.
Okay. So let's pass it off to Laurel Scheinfeld and Sunny Chung.
Thank you. So we're Sunny Chung and Laurel Scheinfeld from Stony Brook University Libraries. Our presentation is exploring methods for assessing accuracy of APA style citations, a scoping review, which we've collaborated on with our colleagues Christine Fina, Chris Kretz, Clara Tron, and Myra Reisman. So Laurel is a subject specialist for the School of Social Welfare, and I'm the subject specialist for the School of Nursing, which both heavily use APA. And our co-authors work closely with departments that also heavily use APA citations, such as psychology, education, and the science and engineering programs. Laurel and I conducted our prior study on accuracy of citation on demand tools focused on PubMed and Ovid Medline. That study is being published this month in the Journal of the Medical Library Association. From that study, we started to see that the citation accuracy could also be defined and measured in many different ways. So for this scoping review, we wanted to gather the terminology, disciplines, and ways to assess accuracy. So our team consists of 6 librarians. We followed the JBI methodology and Prisma SCR, which is the Prisma Scoping Review reporting. Our methodology was step 1, we wrote a protocol and registered it in the Open Science Framework, or OSF. Step 2, we created the search for 7 databases plus Google, as well as Google Scholar. So we searched Academic Search Complete, Business Source Complete, CINAHL, Education Source Complete, Lista, ProQuest Basic, and Web of Science. And then we deduplicated following the Bramer method and had about 7,103 results after deduplication. And then step 3 for screening, we completed a title and abstract screening followed by a full text screening. That was followed by 2 rounds of citation searching following the recommendations of Tarsus statement. And then all of the screening involved 2 people reviewing each article and then resolving conflicts. So in the end, we had a total of 47 articles. And then step 4, we completed data extraction on Google Forms. Step 5, we had evidence synthesis, which we're still working on the evidence synthesis piece, but we do have some preliminary results to share with you today. But we're also doing a database analysis, which will tell us which databases our included articles came from. And then also a citation chasing analysis, which will tell us why those additional articles were not picked up by the search originally. So one of the main findings from this review is that we came across 3 different types of citation accuracy described in the literature. So the first is whether the cited source actually supports the argument that's being made. The second is whether the elements of the citation are accurate when compared to the original source. So an example would be, are the author's names spelled correctly and is the correct journal listed? And the third is whether the citation conforms to APA formatting guidelines. So the example would be if sentence case is used for the article title or if the journal title is italicized. We would suggest that all of these elements be incorporated when planning to teach or support students in learning APA style. And we also suggest that there should be more specific terminology that's agreed upon and widely used to describe each of these 3 types of accuracy rather than referring to all of them as citation accuracy. So we hope to recommend clear terminology to be used in the future.
Okay, so here are some additional results from our review. The 47 included studies spanned a time frame from 1987 to 2024. A little over half of the studies, 52%, used the 5th or 6th edition of the APA publication manual. About 20% used either the 3rd or 7th edition. And very interestingly, a little more than a quarter of the studies didn't specify which edition of the manual was used. It struck us as odd that studies on APA citation accuracy would not mention the edition of the manual used to assess the citations, but that was the case for 14 of our included studies. Librarians were authors on 42% of our included studies. Authors from psychology, education, and nursing made up another 35%. Which made sense since these are disciplines that heavily use APA style. 76% of authors were from North America, 20% were from Asian countries, and 2% each were from Africa and Australia. Interestingly, there were no European studies. The references analyzed in the studies came mainly from journal article reference lists or student assignments, but some came from other sources like dissertations or databases, and the most recently published study even used ChatGPT to generate the citations. There were a few tools mentioned for assessing accuracy. One study devised their own reference verification form. Another created a rubric consisting of 10 criteria. And a third study mentioned using a scoring checklist for quality of the reference list. So we'll be taking a closer look at these tools as we analyze our data further. And similar to what Sunny shared about the terminology surrounding the overall concept of citation accuracy, a lot of different terminology was used to describe errors as well. We noted the terms major versus minor errors, trivial impact versus high impact errors, alphabetic versus numeric errors, and user versus software errors. We also noted the terms syntax errors, formatting errors, content errors, general errors, fatal flaws, referencing errors, layout errors, style errors, typing errors, and bibliographic errors. So again, as Sunny said, we think this wide variation and lack of consistency in terminology is a problem that makes it very difficult to compare results between studies. And we hope to be able to make some recommendations around terminology after further analysis of our data. As far as bias and limitations in the included studies, two types were most often noted. The first was limited types of sources being analyzed. For example, the references analyzed may have been from one specific journal or from a student assignment in one particular course. The second source of bias or limitation noted frequently was having only one reviewer determining whether a citation was accurate. So these are some recommendations. We may make some recommendations around methodology for conducting these types of studies going forward as well. As far as equity, inclusion, and diversity, there were 4 articles that had English language abstracts and foreign language full text that made it through to the full text stage of our screening that we didn't assess. So we don't know if any of those articles could have possibly met our inclusion criteria, and if so, how they might have added to or changed our results. We'd like to find a way to have them translated. There was also another equity, diversity, and inclusion issue we noted in several studies related to author names, specifically the transposition of surname and given name, or confusion about the order of someone's name. One example of this is that authors with a Chinese name typically write their surname or last name first, but Chinese authors with a non-Chinese given name write the given name first. Incorrect order of names was also cited as a possible issue with Muslim, Korean, Hungarian, and Spanish names. This is something we found very interesting and we'd like to explore further. So our next steps are to do an analysis, to do additional analysis of our data, including the database analysis and citation searching analysis that Sunny mentioned, to publish our scoping review in an open access journal, to determine how to implement standard terminology for citation accuracy, possibly reaching out to the APA to work together on this, and to consider how we might conduct another research study on author names from different countries. So thank you very much for listening. And we also want to give credit to Slides Carnival for our slide deck theme.
Great. Thank you, Laurel and Sunny. Really interesting research. And I think we're all interested to see the continuation of your findings and what you all discover. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, please put those in the chat. I'm also going to just go ahead and paste our survey and then a link to the presenter's slides. So I think while we're waiting for questions, I'll get started, and maybe just a question for each of the presenter groups who are still here. What was the most interesting part of your research and maybe the biggest challenge? If you could just give us maybe a 1 to 2 sentence summary for each of those. And we can maybe start with Patrick and just go in the order that we presented today.
Sure. So for me, I'll go with the biggest challenge aspect. And I think it was just the amount of qualitative data to wade through, and thinking about how I had to learn how to analyze video data, which was much different than anything that I've ever done before. So learning that particular process and just sifting through that and making connections with a fresh mind was probably the most difficult for me.
Yeah, I can say one of the comments made in our last presentation struck me as well, where we ran into that it was all of these studies that you can't really compare to each other, where when we were looking at curriculum material center research, how people were defining that varied, and it makes it so it's just very hard to track historical changes. So there's very little like longitudinal information, which can be challenging. And you can make assumptions, but they're not research-based in many ways because of different research methodologies used over time. So that was a challenge for myself. I don't know, Jenelle, if you want to say like something that you loved or enjoyed about our research.
Oh, no, go ahead, Caitlin. I definitely agree with you on the challenge. That was a great challenge.
Yeah, I will say one thing that I did enjoy too was building off of the work of the Curriculum Materials Committee and just thinking about what is data that already exists that we could revisit, and what studies have already been done where we could maybe look at the data captured there and then see how it can be looked at through new eyes or new perspectives. So that was really interesting to me personally.
Yeah, so for our study, I would say that one of the things I found interesting in looking at the analysis of the databases that we searched was, we made an effort to use gray literature, which is recommended, but we did not get no articles exclusively came from our Google or Google Scholar search. So I found that interesting. And as far as a challenge, I think the methodology around scoping reviews and just how long they take and how much work it is to do a scoping review is a continuous challenge. It really did take a full year to complete that. I don't know if there's anything else, Sunny, that you wanted to add.
Oh, I guess I would say like the OSF protocol took a lot longer than we expected. It took 3 full meetings, which we did 1-hour meetings across 3 months. So it basically took 3 months, even though Laurel wrote the whole thing and we were just looking it over as a group to make sure we were agreeing. But yeah, that definitely took a lot of time.
It looks like we have one question for Laurel and Sunny in the chat. What is the standard you used for name formatting for citation quality?
What is the standard we use for name formatting for citation quality? So in this scoping review, we were looking at how our included studies looked at, for names other than English. Okay, thank you. So yeah, we haven't had a chance to look at that. That was another surprising and interesting factor that came up in our data, that there were some, several studies, I think 3 or 4 that mentioned inaccuracies in author names. And when they tracked them back, it turned out that the names were transposed, between first and last, or something similar to that. So we really haven't had a chance to delve into that further, but it definitely piqued our interest, and it's something that, we want to look into, but honestly, we haven't had a chance to really discuss it, or we need to talk about how we would look into that and how you would assess accuracy of that. So it's not something that we really have answers to, but yes, different countries have different standards. And so when it comes, it will be interesting, I think, to look when it comes to APA, how to assess accuracy for that and how to determine what someone's name is accurately, their surname, both their first and last name. I think it's an interesting challenge.
All right, well, we are at time, unfortunately, but within each of the slides that the presenters shared, I know that they have their contact information. So after this session and after reviewing their slides, if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to them. And I just want to say another thank you to all of our presenters for all of the work that they did and for sharing their really interesting research with us. We're really glad to have you here, and keep an eye on your email for the recording to be sent out in the next couple of days. Thank you, everyone.